Encounter with unknown beings in a series of caves on the island of Malta, just below the southern tip of Italy in the extreme western part of the Mediterranean, is the island of Malta. In the past, it was occupied by various nations and has been considered one of the most strategic areas of the world, a port and a crossroads of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East and Africa. This small island, only 14.5 kilometers long, was already an ancient center of culture when it was conquered by the Phoenicians of Carthage, when a group of priests worshipped the god Moloch, visited the island in the Old Testament times. The islanders readily accepted their teachings, along with the offering of what they had then, the human sacrifices, to propitiate Moloch. And the reason was because the ancient Maltese themselves made such sacrifices to the gods of the underworld that they believe existed beneath their island, which they often equated with serpents, quote unquote. When the Apostle Paul visited the island, which was called Melita, Acts of Apostles, he was bitten by a viper snake in the island. Paul, without being disturbed, however, shook the snake from his hand into the burning fire, and he was not harmed. The Maltese, seeing that he neither swelled or died, regarded him as a god. Now, since the time of the Carthaginians, Malta has received many rulers: Romans, Arabs, Normans, Castilians, the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, later known as the Knights of Rhodes, and still later as the Knights of Malta, which remain there to this day, having their second headquarters in Rome. A few miles south of the city of Valletta is a small village of Casalpala, and there in 1902, while some workers were digging a well, the earth gave way and they fell into it, and thus they discovered a series of ancient caves dug mostly into the solid rock, which descended into the earth and into the lower three levels. These multiple level catacombs became known as the Cemetery of Hal Safliedi, after the street under which they were discovered. Near the floor of the last chamber in the third and last officially recognized sublevel of these ancient catacombs, there are some so-called burial chambers. These are square, only 1 meter long, located just to the right of the floor, and one has to kneel down to be able to look into them. As soon as they allowed someone to crawl into them, for many years there were rumors that one of these chambers did not end, but continued deeper into another unexplored cave even further. This appears to be the underground passage and chamber mentioned in the National Geographic magazine article August 1940. That article stated the following regarding several people who had disappeared into these catacombs without a trace. Many underground passages, they said, along with ancient catacombs, now form a part of the fortifications and defense system of the island. In many of these galleries, various supplies are kept, and in some of them, bombs. Some of the underground areas under Valletta served as houses for the poor. Some prehistoric people had built temples and chambers inside these crypts. In a pit next to a sacrificial altar are thousands of human skeletons. Years ago, one could walk underground from one end of Malta to the other, but the government closed the entrances to these arcades after the disappearance of some students and their teacher who were taking a tour of them in this cave labyrinth. But as the story goes deeper, that the National Geographic article shows, other sources state that these catacombs, about 30 children disappearing during their tour, and that at the beginning, when the underground was discovered, about 30,000 human skeletons of men, women, and children, victims of the ancient human sacrifices to the gods of the underworld, were also discovered. Also, in an old edition of Borderland Science, appeared an article by Louis Jessup, who was then working at the British Embassy and later became a secretary at the Flying Saucer Information Service, NYSIB, in New York. Jessup claimed to have visited Malta and the underground before the children's tragic disappearance and again shortly after. And she described how on her first visit to the catacombs, she finally convinced her guide to allow her to explore one of the death chambers near the floor of the last chamber in the third basement, which she assumed was the end of the underground tour, and seeming to know something she did not, the guide told her that she could enter only at her own risk for what might happen to her. She did this by holding a candle in her hand and using her loose, broad belt as a guide for her friend, who followed her. He crawled through the small passage and came out at last into a large cave, being on a ledge from which he looked down upon a bottomless chasm, and below on the other side of the chasm was another ledge which seemed to lead to an entrance or portico in the opposite wall. Jessup swore the following really happened. Out of this lower gallery on the opposite side of the chasm, she claimed that some very large hairy humanoid beings appeared with hair all over their bodies. And while watching her, they raised their hands in her direction, palms facing out, and immediately a strong wind blew out, blowing out her candle. Then she felt some wet and slippery thing touch her and pass her by. All this happened as her friend, who was behind her and following her, started to appear from the passage in the cave. Her friends could not understand her panicked attempt to get back to the basement room, but were eventually forced to accept it by her persistence. When they were back in the underground chamber, the driver saw her expression and gave her a look that understood what was going on. He understood what was going on. About a week after the disappearance of the children and their teacher, on her second visit to this place, she saw a new guide, but he denied that anyone but him had ever worked there, but it seemed that he was hiding something. He eventually learned from other sources that this was the tunnel the children and their teacher, possibly the old driver, had entered. He also learned that after the last child passed, the collapse happened. Although the official attribution states that the walls collapsed on the students, search teams were never able to locate any trace of their teacher, even though the rope they had used to tie themselves was found to have been cut by a sharp tool rather than a rock that fell. He also learned that the screams and cries of the children had been heard for weeks underground in various parts of the island, but they could not locate them. As for the catacombs under Malta itself, there are some ancient stories which say that the deep caverns beneath the island continue underground, beyond the shores, and some say a part of this labyrinth stretches for hundreds of kilometers to the north and intersects with the catacombs under Rome, or at least it did in ancient times. So these catacombs connecting with Rome and other areas, could these be the ones that were the underground passages that connected to Europe and even all the way up to Scotland? Who knows? Please leave your comments and thank you for your support. Finally, support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.